I want to talk about belonging, and it's something that I often think about, and I know that for myself, it is something that I can often and do often take for granted. I mean, I think I take for granted the fact that I belong to a certain family. Um, and I think I take for granted the fact that I belong, or at least am a citizen of a country. I'm part of a society. I belong to the society and the neighborhood that I live in. I belong to, as a member, to various groups and organizations that I engage with. And I don't always think of those in terms of the mutual benefits that we give each other. And sometimes, I forget that it's actually a privilege, in a sense, to be part of something, to belong to something. Um, and that sense of belonging, I believe, is so critical to how we feel safe as human beings in this world. And in fact, the sense of belonging has been linked, inversely linked with the tendency toward addiction. In other words, if you don't have a strong sense of belonging, whether it is with a group or a family or a community, and it is, a chronic sense of a lack of belonging, it can lead towards addictive behaviors. Okay, that's not the part that I really want to go into. I think there are others who know how to deal with that and talk about that more expertly. What I want to talk about is how this sense of belonging can manifest for us. When we are part of something, I think it's only normal to expect that we can feel safe. I think it is only normal that we derive at least some part of our identity from that group or that entity, that organization, that community, that family that we belong to. And it is not always the case, though, that just because we belong in a group, that we feel safe in that group and that we feel valued in that group. And I speak from my own experience that, there are some entities, and I won't say which, that I belong to, that I don't necessarily feel safe in, and that I don't necessarily feel valued in. Now, whilst I say that, I will quickly follow that up by saying that it's, in at least one way of thinking about it, is that nobody is obliged to value us or make us feel valued. But as social beings, which we are, I think it is to our mutual benefit and in our common interest that we value one another. And actually the sense of valuing a person is quite a natural thing. It's quite a spontaneous thing. And it only gets eroded when we start thinking in terms of, like I said the other time, on another video about radical ways of loving, when we start to allow hierarchies and status and roles and all these other ways of transacting value between each other. So, it bothers me that we can be in groups, and sometimes we belong to certain entities, for example, families, without having actually voluntarily chosen to be part of that group, right? Like if you're born in a family, you didn't actually have a choice about being in that family. You were born into it, and you were part of it, and you belonged to it, and so sometimes we find ourselves in groups, in communities, in families, that we don't necessarily feel good about being part of. And of course we have the choice of, separating ourselves, estranging ourselves from these groups. That's up to us. But it often comes with a price, or at least initially it does. So the other thing that I wanted to mention about groups, about belonging, is that it's a two-way thing. For example, I belong to a group or a family, and my family belongs to me. Now, what the nature and degree of the ownership that we feel toward each other can vary, and it may not be symmetrical. That's one of the buzzwords that's come around, symmetry and asymmetry. So sometimes the relationships within the group that we belong to are asymmetrical, and it's not reciprocal. All parties, or both parties, don't necessarily get the same value from each other. And that is sad. That is sad because when there is a devaluing of someone in the group, and I speak from my own experience, when I have felt devalued, diminished, sometimes silenced, sometimes excluded, it can be terribly hurtful, and it's really not an easy thing to live with. And when I say that, I'm not saying that people within the group necessarily intentionally, consciously set out to hurt or demean or to devalue you. I think most of the time it's very unconscious. You know what they say, hurt people hurt people. And I think that is so true, to the extent that we have ripe wounds within us, wounds that keep erupting, wounds that refuse to heal, to the extent that they are there, still active within our body, within our consciousness, or our subconscious, if you want to use that term. They predispose us to certain ways of behaving, of speaking, of thinking, and towards the choices that we make. And when that happens, we can often inadvertently hurt others. Gosh, I've said a bit, and I felt it important to say because I know that we all of us belong to something, to some entity, to some group, and we don't necessarily always feel good within those groups, and yet we rely so heavily on them. As I said, they give us a sense of safety. Even if we may be silenced or devalued, they do to some degree, just by virtue of being something familiar that we can, and stable, that it's always there and we can always go back to it. It does confer on us a sense of safety. And so really what I'm trying to get at is, if we find that we are in a group and that things within the group are not working so well for us, well, what do we do? What are our options? There are options, but they're not always the easiest options to take, and they can be extremely scary. And I know I'm sounding a bit abstract here, and that's because I don't want to get into, specifics, not just now anyway. I think I'll leave it for another video where we can talk about specific examples of how groups can, on the one hand, bolster us and give us a sense of identity and belonging and strength, but they can also be places of deep hurt and deep wounding. Not the best note to finish on, but sometimes these videos that I do are really just to share some of the things that I've reflected on, and whilst I might have my own conclusions on some of those subjects, I don't always on all subjects, and so it's always, I find it useful to just put them out there. And if you happen to be watching them and watching this video and others that I've made, and if what you've heard in this one has triggered a reaction, an objection, you might disagree with what I've had to say, or you might agree, or you have certain thoughts about it. I would love to hear from you, because as I've said before, I think it's just so important to be able to and willing to hear different ideas and worldviews. It's really important. Whether I agree with them or not isn't quite the issue. More important is, even if I don't agree with you, am I willing, do I want to maintain a good relationship with you? And that for me is always paramount. That for me is always the priority. That regardless of whether I agree with you or not, I know for a fact, as a non-negotiable, that I always want to be in a peaceful, harmonious, and loving relationship with you. Now, does that mean that I stay active and conversational? Not necessarily. Sometimes it does mean that I have to take myself out of the space. But taking myself out of the space or being silent doesn't mean that I harbor hostility or anger or grievance against you. It just means that I need to take care of myself first before I can do anything. And I do it in a loving way. Or at least I hope I do. At least I feel the love and peace within me, and that's important, because that's the only barometer I can use. Okay, there, I've said more than I thought I was going to say. So yes, if you're watching this and you have any thoughts about this, do share them with me. And wherever you are, I hope you're having a truly peaceful day or night, and that every day you move in the world feeling a little bit stronger and a little bit more fulfilled. Bye for now.